Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and in today's episode, what I want to talk about is training in a fat loss phase versus outside of it. And the misconception and the common thing that people will do is they'll do more training in fat loss. And in today's episode, I'm going to go over why I think that is a bad idea. This doesn't mean that we're not going to train during fat loss, as I'm going to go over the nuance around this, but the general kind of thought process is, oh, hey, during fat loss, I'm going to ramp up training. I'm going to do more. I'm going to make it more intense. And again, I'm going to go over why I think that is problematic. But first, before I go into that, if you want to learn more about a body recomp, I have my free checklist. So I go over 10 things you need for a body recomp, most important things, 2 different types of body recomp, why it's important to focus on body comp over just a scale weight. So again, that will help you move forward with that to really improve your body composition there. So go check that out. The link to that is in the show notes. And again, it's completely free. However, if you do want to potentially work together or learn more about it, there's a link in the show notes to go over that. And also you can reach out to me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_, and we can discuss that in more detail there. So if you're interested in that, go and check that out. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic. So like I said, the big kind of misconception and kind of thought process and game plan around fat loss is, hey, I'm going to do more training. I'm going to burn more calories. I'm going to burn fats. I'm going to ramp up training. I'm going to make it harder. I'm going to sweat more. And that's what's going to help me lose body fats. And again, the reality here with this is your training should actually match your available energy and recovery. In the phase outside of fat loss, that's where we're going to push our training. That's where we're going to drive adaptations. And that's where we can really improve our performance because we're going to have more fuel on board. And that's what's really going to drive those training adaptation and performance, right? In a fat loss phase, our goal is going to shift to mostly maintaining the adaptations that we've built during this time outside of fat loss while creating a sustainable energy deficit. Because again, that is a stressor on the body. You're going to have less resources available for growth and repair. And so the body's not going to prioritize that. But again, people try to throw the kitchen sink at everything, and that's where they start to spin their wheels over time. So these phases outside are where we're really going to push training and adaptations and performance. Now, it doesn't mean, and we're going to dive into this, it doesn't mean that we're not going to train during fat loss. This doesn't mean that that we're just going to get weak and training's going to be terrible. There's still things like we still want to make sure that's in a good spot, but we can't expect to have our best performance. We can't expect to really drive adaptation and training performance and strength, et cetera, in a deficit. That's going to be done outside of a deficit. Now, again, there's some nuance within that too of where you're at, and we'll dive into all that on there. So let's talk about, I want to go over outside of fat loss first, because I think this is the most important. Again, this is the phase that most people are going to skip or they're just going to gloss over, right? What you see a lot of times is people are, if they're not trying to lose weight or a fat loss diet, they're not really doing anything. And again, that's a big mistake in terms of actually changing your body composition over time. It's a very important part of the process. But again, most people are not on things during that, or they just maybe kind of half-ass their training during that time. They're not really focused on it because they're not in a fat loss phase. But this is really the time to push training, and this is where we can really make the most significant gains that are going to set us up long-term, okay? And so outside of fat loss, then this is going to be maintenance or a small surplus that we're going to be at here. Because we're going to have more fuel on board, we're going to be able to push training in this sense. So when we look at lifting, obviously this is a great time to increase your training volume. So again, most people are going to do that when they're in a deficit. Oh, I need to ramp up training volume during this time. But if anything, this would be the time that I would do a bit more volume. Not that this doesn't mean that now, hey, you're in a maintenance or surplus and you just need to ramp up volume. But again, this is a time because you have more recovery resources available. You have more fuel. You can really set yourself up to have good training and have the resources available. This is where you can really start to ramp up your training volume. And this is the times that I would start to maybe push a little bit higher training volume if possible, because you have that recovery available. Now, again, you automatically have to do this. You could still get away with keeping volume around the same, maybe be low to moderate type volume. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're really looking for max muscle growth, I think the thing that we're trying to do here is try to get in the most amount of quality volume that you can get in. And again, the quality side of things is going to be raised in this. Now, again, there's going to be some people that just can't handle as much, but generally speaking, you'll be able to do more during this time. And for some people, maybe the goal isn't to absolutely maximize muscle growth. Maybe we do have some time constraints as well, too, that we need to consider here. I'm looking at somebody like Steve Hall's training, and he's doing I looked at his work, I'm like, damn, he is doing a lot of volume, like a lot of sets, a lot of exercises. And for him, he's got the time, he's got the recovery, he's not in a fat loss phase right now, and he can push it, right? But for some people that have a full-time job, like for myself right now, like I'm in a phase where I'm eating in maintenance, small surplus, and I'm still not pushing volume a ton because I also, from a recovery standpoint, I feel like I just don't from the time perspective is the biggest thing, and I end up having to lift later in the day. And so it's like training, unfortunately, isn't the number one priority right now for me. And just what I can handle and where I feel like my quality volume is a little bit lower than what it would typically be. But this would be the time that I would try and push volume versus in a deficit there. And this is also a great time to focus on body part specialization phases. For example, like if you're really trying to bring up a certain muscle group, again, this would be the time to do it, not in a fat loss phase. That wouldn't be the time to have like super high glute volume if you're trying to bring up your glutes. From there, the big thing, if you want to bring up your glutes, it would be, hey, eat at maintenance or a small surplus, really try and push glute specialization or at least enough volume to where you can really push it then. And then when we fat loss diet, get to enough volume, whatever your sort of base volume is, and then have better dieting strategies to maintain as much muscle as possible in your glutes when you're fat loss dieting on there, right? So that's how you do it. Or again, if you want to bring up your arms, same kind of thing. I wouldn't blast your arms into an arm specialization phase in a fat loss diet. However, I would do that when I'm eating at maintenance or a small surplus on there. Because again, there has to be a give and take somewhere. Either you're not going to have enough recovery to where you can't do that high volume in a fat loss phase, but you also, because if you bring up volume somewhere, like that has to come from somewhere, and something is going to have to either decrease or just not have as much resources in a fat loss phase that could impact other muscle groups specifically, right? We obviously want to keep, and again, this is also where we could just try higher volumes in general, and this would be the time to test it out there. We also keep intensity high, right? So work at that 0 to 3 RIR. Again, most people end up not doing that during this phase because they're like, hey, I'm not in a fat loss phase, so I don't really want to push it as hard. I'm in a maintenance phase, right? However, whatever people say during this. No, this is the time that if you really want to make change, you need to push your training during this time. Does that mean you need to always do that all the time? No, there's certain phases that are going to lend itself better to doing this and phases where you need to back off potentially. But I think no matter what, I think most of the time, and this is really going to depend on the person, so it's hard to say, but for myself, like I'm still going to train close to 0 to 3 RIR most of the time. Again, if I'm a little under recovered, maybe I'll go slightly higher than that. But again, I think it's still important to do that and keep intensity high. And where you fall on that spectrum is going to depend on the week you're in your training cycle, how you're feeling, etc., what exercise you're doing, all that. And in lifting, we still want to push progressions during this time there. So again, this would be done during a small surplus. Now, obviously, we still want to try and push progressions as much as we can, even in a deficit. But again, this is going to be the time where you're really going to be able to push those and make your biggest strength and muscle gain increases there. So to sum up the lifting side of things, great time to do higher volume. This is the time to do specialization phases. We still need to keep intensity high, and we want to push progressions normally there, right? From a cardio perspective, this is a great time to build your cardiovascular fitness. Again, this is a time where people are like, well, hey, I'm not fat loss dieting, so I'm going to take cardio out. But I would argue that this is an even more important time to actually do cardiovascular fitness training during a time where you're at maintenance or a small surplus, especially as you add more muscle. It's important, right? Because just by being in a deficit and losing weight, you'll improve your cardiovascular fitness just by doing that, because you're going to be at a lighter body weight, and a deficit does have some unique adaptations as well too. And so but it's more so the body weight thing where you're going to see some cardiovascular fitness adaptations. Plus, your resting heart rate does tend to go down a bit when you're eating a little bit less. So you're probably a little bit more metabolic efficient. So again, so you're naturally going to see it, but you also need to so it's naturally going to improve then. So again, we could still improve a little bit in a fat loss phase, but this is the time that we really need to push it, improve our fitness during these times when we have enough fuel on board. You can handle higher cardio volumes as well too. So again, this would be the time that I would push a little bit more cardio volume because you can handle it as well too there. So I wouldn't, again, when I go into fat loss, I wouldn't now all of a sudden ramp up cardio because I'm in fat loss, I'm trying to lose body fat. I would keep it at least around the same, and I wouldn't just ramp it up in a fat loss phase. But this would be the time that you can do more because you have more fuel on board. From an energy balance perspective, your body's, all right, we got enough fuel coming in, we feel good. And so you can handle more and you can do more in a building phase. And there's probably more room for higher intensity work. Again, this all comes back to the resources and everything that you have available there. Whereas when you're in a deficit and you're trying to keep high intensity work up, it's going to be a bit more fatiguing, and that's going to dig into your recovery dig into a recovery hole. And again, you only have so many resources available for things there, right? And also, this would be a time when if you have performance related things as well too, you'd want to do this in a phase where you're eating at maintenance or a small surplus. And performance related being if you're doing some sort of race. Again, I have a client doing like a month-long expedition. You would want to do that around this phase. If you're an athlete, during your competition season, times when you are a little bit more focused on performance, like you need to feel enough here. So you'd want to pair that around this period of time as well too. Why is this the case for all this? Why do we want to push training more during this time? You have more energy available, which means better recovery, and you have more capacity to adapt and actually make changes to your body composition, at least adding muscle. And again, you have you're able to actually perform as best as you can because you have enough fuel on board. Now, again, there's going to be some small minor details that we can work on still that are going to be important. Making sure you sleep enough, circadian rhythm stuff, still managing overall stress load, still managing overall training volume. You can't just now, hey, I'm in a maintenance phase, so now I can just, or I'm eating at maintenance or a small surplus, now I can just go crazy with training. You still, these things still apply. You still need to focus on it. Meal timing is still important. Your macro balance, like all these things still matter, but generally speaking, you have more fuel available, so you can push training a bit more during this time. All right, so now let's switch over to fat loss. So during fat loss, what is the goal? What are we trying to do from a training perspective? Because I think people get this mixed up. The goal is to, and I guess this isn't necessarily just training, but what is our goal overall with the fat loss phase? It's to create a deficit while maintaining muscle and performance. However, in some situations, you can build muscle, right? You're going to be able to build some muscle in a deficit. It depends on where you're at. We'll talk about what that looks like. So again, don't take this as, oh, hey, building phase, I'm just going to push training, fat loss. I'm not really going to care about training. No, like we still need to push training because you still can have some adaptations. Again, it's going to depend on where you're at from a body composition standpoint, where you're deficit wise, what your setup looks like, how long you've been dieting. These things do all matter, and we need to take them into consideration. And saying that though, like the main goal of the fat loss phase is we need to create a deficit. Now, again, some people can do that with a little bit more activity, but if that's the case, and we'll talk about this, higher output means you probably need to bring your calories up a little bit in that process. Otherwise, to me, I don't think that's the most efficient thing to do is to have high output and a very low caloric intake. I just don't think, it's just not a very efficient thing to do in terms of the only thing that would really do is you get better at training in a deficit, but from an overall adaptation standpoint, like that's not going to be the greatest spot to be in. And again, that's where some people they're going to run into a little bit more issues from like a recovery standpoint. Your body's probably going to adapt a bit more. You're probably not going to burn as many calories as you would if you were fueled as well too. So, but again, our goal, again, we have different ways that we can create a deficit. You can do a little bit more movement. So you could eat the same amount and do more movement, and that would create a deficit. But you could obviously eat less, keep movement the same, and that's a way to do it. And you can do a slight combination of both. But again, anytime that gap starts to widen in terms of energy output and low calorie intake, your body does adapt. And it's like for the amount of effort that you're doing, your body will adapt. And again, that's where people can dig themselves into a recovery hole. So again, main goal of fat loss phase is to create that deficit. And this is why this isn't a long-term thing. Like we shouldn't be always trying to be in a deficit because again, we know performance isn't going to be as good and we do want to get in and out. And again, our goal with training is we're really more so, yes, we can still build a little bit of performance. We can still build a little bit of muscle in a deficit, but it's not maximized. And so we don't want to be there forever. But the main goal is to create that energy deficit. And that's the main thing. And again, it's mostly going to be a nutrition thing. But again, some people can do some activity related things to get into that deficit. All right. So from a lifting perspective, maybe you're going to do slightly lower volume. I'm not saying across like you just need to slash volume. It just depends. But we're going to do more so of a base amount of volume, right? It's just isn't a time that you're going to increase volume is essentially what I'm getting at because people will hear that and be like, oh, so now I need to slash my volume. No, that's not necessarily the case. But let's say you did a building phase and you brought your volume up, you could keep it around there. Or maybe if you did bring it up, then maybe you go back to that sort of baseline there. Maybe you did increase volume during your build and then you go into a fat loss. Maybe you just keep it there versus increasing it, right? And this all depends. And we'll talk about the difference in terms of the size of the deficit, how that's going to impact what you can do, et cetera, on there. So again, we're looking at slightly lower base amount of volume. This isn't the time to increase volume. Also, I'm not doing a body part specialization during this time. So for example, again, like maybe you were like, hey, I really want to focus on bringing up my glutes. So we do a little bit more glute volume. And again, in this state, we're not going to increase our glute volume during this time. Like you're going to keep volume evenly spread out throughout your muscle groups. Now, in saying that, you obviously know, hey, certain muscle groups maybe get a little bit more volume, a little bit less. But again, you're going to your base. You're not ramping up volume in any one thing during that period of time. We want to have our volume a little bit more evenly spread out. So what I mean by that is, for me, legs are something that I can get away with a little bit less volume compared to my upper body. So I have to do a little bit more upper body volume. So essentially what that means is I'm going to keep my legs more at base. I'm just not going, like I would keep that at my base. And then obviously upper body would be a little bit higher from that perspective. But again, that's just my typical kind of response to training and what the amount that I need for me specifically. So knowing yourself there with that. But again, I'm not going to do an arm specialization phase in that period of time, right? I'm going to be at base in my upper body. But again, same thing. We're still going to train fairly close to failure most of the time. Obviously, you'll adjust that based on your recovery around that time. But again, we still want to train 0 to 3 RIR. I think that's still super important from a weight training perspective there. And then we want to focus on quality work, right? And I think this really comes down to training a little bit closer to that 6 to 12-ish rep range there, right? You'll see a lot of people be like, oh, I'm going to go super, like, I'm going to do high rep sets, more burn type training. And I think that's a mistake in a fat loss phase. I think we need to keep most of our training in that 5 to 10, 5 to 12-ish rep range when it comes to this, right? Because again, that's the kind of sweet spot for muscle building, because it's like there's still fatigue costs to train close to failure, but if you're in that 1 to 2 RIR in 6 to 12 reps, it's like that's a great, like, to me, that's the almost magic stimulus to keep fatigue managed and getting a good adaptation, right? And again, when we're in a deficit itself as a stressor, we're going to have less fuel on board, so our recovery capacity is a little bit lower. So it's like we need to get a little bit more out of our training, and we need it to be in a way that's going to produce some adaptation, but also come at the lowest recovery kind of cost there. And that's where that 6 to 12-ish rep range kind of comes into play for all those reasons there. Whereas when you start getting higher than that, and it's like you start doing work where maybe it's not as high quality work, you're a little bit further away from failure, but it's also a little bit more fatiguing. It kind of sucks. And so it's like you don't necessarily get the best of both worlds there. So this doesn't mean you can't go higher than this. It just means, I think personally, that now we start to add a little bit more fatigue for a little bit less quality training in that process than in the 6 to 12. So that's where, again, I'm mostly focused on slightly lower to moderate volume in that 6 to 12 rep range, which is probably a lot different than what most people do from a weight training perspective. They're going to do super high volume, pump type training, high rep training. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's going to start to dig into your recovery capacity, which now means that you have less resources available for the deficit, right? It's going to be a little bit harder to stay on track. You're going to burn out a little bit quicker. Like, you may not have as good of a look as you diet down. You might have a little bit more inflammation overall. You may find that maybe you're not building any muscle in a deficit, so that's going to potentially hurt your look, right? I think if we can still put ourselves in a position to build some muscle, like, that's obviously going to improve your physique as you get leaner there. So again, it all comes down to this type of training. I feel like from a lifting perspective allows you to have the recovery resources available to help with the main goal of creating a deficit during fat loss. Whereas once we go away from this, we do higher volume, et cetera. And now that digs into that, and it takes away, and you're probably not providing the best stimulus from a muscle building perspective there. Again, that's what we're looking at with lifting. You're probably looking at anywhere from 6 to 12 sets per muscle group. Again, on average, depends on the person and everything like that, but that's probably around what you're looking at per muscle group per week there with that. Okay, so from a cardio perspective, again, we have to be super mindful of total training volume, how much you're doing. Obviously, your lifting adds into that. Any other training you like to do outside of these two things, and which I'll actually park that for after I go over cardio. But again, we want to be mindful of total training volume. So again, how much cardio we're doing, how much weight training we're doing. Because again, if we just start to do a lot when recovery resources are a little bit lower, that's where we can start to run into some issues here. And now we're just adding a lot of fatigue. We're spinning our wheels. Our body's more focused on recovery than any sort of adaptation, which we already know is going to be a little bit tougher. But again, this is going to start to dig into your overall recovery resources. We probably want to bias a little bit lower intensity work, zone 2, zone 3 type work, big scale. Now, in saying that, I still think you can do some quote unquote higher intensity work. Again, think your intervals and stuff like that, but you want to be careful with really high intensity type stuff, because that is going to dig into your recovery. So again, it's like one of those things where, what is your overall stress load? How are you managing the deficit? Are you recovering well? Because that's obviously going to impact how much you can do here and what you can get away from or get away with in this period of time. But we're going to limit that high intensity work. We're going to do a little bit less of that during this phase than I would in a phase where we're well fueled, right? So again, this could look like I said, a little bit more zone 2. If we look at, hey, you're doing 3 cardio sessions per week, 2 of those are going to be zone 2, zone 3, and then you're going to do maybe one day that's a little bit more interval based, that's closer to 7 to 8 RPE. We're not going to ever get to that 9 to 10 RPE from that perspective there. And again, your steps don't count towards this. Like, to me, that is separate, and we'll talk about steps and what that looks like, but your steps are separate. This isn't steps that we're talking about here. This is cardio where you're going on some sort of machine, you're running, and again, you're getting that heart rate above 130, 140, which again, for most people, walking is not going to do that. So this is your a little bit higher intensity type stuff, your actual cardiovascular fitness training here. So again, we need to be mindful of total training volume for cardio, how much you're doing overall. And we probably want to start to bias a little bit more lower intensity work. That doesn't mean you just need to go in and do all zone 2. It just means, hey, if you're doing 3 sessions, maybe 75%, 2/3 of that is more this lower intensity versus 50-50. Right? And again, overall, we want to probably limit that high intensity, how high we climb. So again, we're talking, again, that 9, 10 RPE that we're doing there with that. And so, like I said, really our goal is to just maintain our cardiovascular fitness. You're not going to drive a ton of performance during this period of time, because the more that you have to you need to do a certain amount of volume, you need to hit a certain amount of intensity when it comes to cardio. And again, we just talked about all these things that are going to limit both of those. And so this isn't the time to really push that. Like I said, you'll see some cardiovascular fitness improvements by just dropping some weight. Being in a deficit in itself that will be done through obviously more so nutrition than it would be like through doing hard training and stuff like that there. And so again, this isn't the time to push your cardiovascular fitness. You're going to do that when we can do a little bit more volume, when we can really push intensity during those phases when you're at maintenance or a small surplus there. So again, probably opposite of what most people do. What are they going to do? They're going to ramp up their cardio. They're going to do, hey, I need to do some high intensity work. I need to do more HIIT intervals. I need to do a bunch of cardio. And again, saying the opposite here of we have to watch how much we do during a fat loss phase. So again, what's the difference here between being in this maintenance surplus versus being in a fat loss phase? Less energy available means, one, the body's more likely to compensate for higher output. So the higher our output is, and again, we're in a deficit, our body will, and the more we do, and again, that gap starts to widen, our body's going to compensate a bit more. So what that means is for the amount of energy that you're expending, like one, you're not going to be able to perform as well. And for the amount of work that you're doing, your body will compensate a bit. So it's, hey, you're not going to expend as much energy doing that. Your body will compensate elsewhere for that. And again, there's lower recovery resources available. So again, you can spin your wheels. You could be working super hard in your training, but you're not really able to make any sort of adaptations in that period of time. And so again, this is where we have to manage our overall volume and intensity and balance that out during a fat loss phase. Real quick on the fat loss phase and lifting. Like I said, I would much rather somebody be in that 6 to 12 rep range and do a little less volume than do a bunch of volume and be in that higher rep range with lighter weight, if that makes sense. I think I went over that, but just wanted to go over that again. So again, we have just lower recovery resources available in general, right? So less ability to recover and adapt. And then again, fueling for training becomes a challenge. If we're in a deficit, like something has to give somewhere, right? You can't have max carbohydrates in a deficit, right? Because then that means protein's super low. That's not going to be great from a body composition standpoint. So there has to be give and take. And again, if we're talking about fueling around training, then hey, yeah, we want to fuel around training, but then what do you do the rest of the day? Then you are basically on poverty food the rest of the day. Or if we're not fueling around our training and we have it more spread out, then that can impact your training and how hard you can push. There's just that give and take and with this lower intake, right? So again, fat loss isn't about doing more. It's about doing enough while recovering on fewer resources and creating that energy deficit. And this isn't the time to push performance and to really build muscle growth and to really push our cardiovascular fitness. It's more about maintaining those adaptations that we built outside so we can put all our resources to that energy deficit, so we're more likely to be able to actually stick to the energy deficit. And then again, when we're out of this phase, we can start to push things a bit more. Again, in saying that, this doesn't mean that this doesn't mean you could train a lot, because we're going to go over what this looks like. Two, this doesn't mean that performance should just get pushed to the wayside during fat loss and you should just accept feeling weaker and not. We still want to set up performance as best as we can. It's just we have to be realistic with what we can do during this time. All right, so let's go to a few caveats here with all this. So one, if you want to maintain high training volumes in a fat loss phase, which people do, right? People love training for whatever reason. If you want to keep output high, and which you can, we have to make sure recovery's there. We have to watch things. But again, if you like to do a lot of training in a fat loss phase, that's fine. We can make this work. But what you have to do is you need to support that output with higher calories while still creating a energy deficit. So that may get a little confusing for people, but what that just means is you wouldn't go as low as someone that is not moving as much. You would need to adjust, because obviously the higher our energy flux is, that increases our total daily energy expenditure. And so your calories need to match to that. But again, we still need to create that energy deficit. This doesn't mean that you can eat 5,000 calories and then all of a sudden you'll be in an energy deficit. There is some limits to this, right? And as I was telling you, the more we move and the more that gap widens in terms of energy intake and output, the body will compensate. And so you can't just ramp up to, say, expending 1,500 calories and then being at 5,000, right? The body is smart and it will adapt to that, and it will downregulate metabolism elsewhere to make up for that. So you need to increase your caloric intake to match that. But again, there's still going to be that limit in terms of this, right? And so you'll see this maybe in someone who, like, for example, I have this client that's doing a month-long expedition in Alaska in a mountain. And this is the first time I've been working with her since she's done this, but she's told me, hey, in the past, she's always lost like 20-ish pounds or around there during that time. And that's what, like, your output is just so high that it's like you're going to naturally get into a deficit. Now, most people aren't going to be able to do that. And like, she has to do that because it's, hey, you want to get through this expedition and you want to do it. Again, you see this in maybe endurance runners, right? Like their energy output is so high, but again, they still have to fuel for that. And there's still going to be a limit eventually to all this. Yeah, right. But again, a lot of people, what do? They ramp up output and then their intake goes down and now their output is not as good. they're doing a lot of output. So it's like you're just spinning your wheels, and body adapts as well too. Again, you can't just slash calories hard and push high training output, at least longer than a few days or weeks. Somebody could definitely do this for a week or two or a couple days and they would be fine. But eventually it's going to catch up and you're going to run into some issues, right? That's where performance drops, recovery suffers, and the body compensates the most, and you spin your wheels. You're not really seeing fat loss. Your body is probably super inflamed. You're super under recovered. Obviously, there's no muscle growth, potentially even some muscle loss as well too. And like I said, the body will adapt elsewhere. You're more likely to get sick, et cetera, during this time. Again, if we want to maintain a higher output during fat loss, we have to adjust the caloric intake to that, but obviously still create the energy deficit, because if we don't do that, that obviously defeats the purpose of the fat loss phase. You're not just going to magically lose body fat if you're not creating a deficit. Again, you would need to look at that. And again, recovery becomes even more important during that time, good fueling strategies, etc. Caveat number 2 here is how much you can push in a fat loss phase does depend on context, because like I've been saying throughout, I don't want people to now think, oh, I can't push it all in fat loss. That's not true. The size of your deficit is important here. So again, the larger the deficit is, aka the quicker the weight loss is, it's going to start to impact training a bit more. And so this is why earlier I said, hey, smart kind of feel like smart fat loss setup. Before we are focused on body composition, somewhat focused on performance, we want to maintain these adaptations. We probably don't want to be super aggressive with weight loss for extended periods of time. Because again, the other piece of that is how long you've been dieting. Obviously, the longer you do that, the more it's going to impact you. But also when I say how long you've been dieting, if you just started a fat loss phase, that would be the time that you could probably push things a little bit more, because it's the beginning of the fat loss phase. Whereas as you get deeper into it, the longer you go and the more aggressive it is, the less likely you are that you're going to be able to maintain, to have the high, like your performance and training, et cetera, is going to start to get impacted a bit more in that situation, right? And how lean you are. So again, if you take someone that's super aggressive with their diet, they've been dieting for a while and they're super lean, it's okay. They're going to be the people that are going to have the lowest recovery capacity, even if you're having everything dialed in, because that is a big piece to this as well too. But just based on that, so again, if you take someone that's a little bit less moderate, like they have a slow fat loss phase or slow deficit, they just started dieting and they're moderate body fats, like they're going to be able to push training a bit more than that other person. So that is vitally important to this as well too. So like I said, someone early in a moderate deficit at moderate to higher body fat levels can often still push training performance. And this is where you see more recomp, right? Because it makes sense. You're able to push training a bit more. You have the resources available. You have the body fat available. You're not in a super aggressive diet. So this is where you can recomp a bit more. Whereas again, someone leaner and deeper into a deficit will have fewer recovery resources and need to be more strategic. And this is going to be your more traditional sort of fat loss phase there, where it's, hey, we're really, at that point, you really do just have to maintain what you can. And then obviously you can take that to the extreme of someone that's super lean. They're trying to push fat loss, say, to get on stage or whatever it is. Those are the people that are at the highest risk of losing lean body mass there. But also, let's take the current landscape of GLP-1. They are saved by the fact that they have most people are going to do it are at higher body fat levels, so they can be a bit more aggressive. They are aggressive with it. They don't really weight train during that, right? Their training side of things is not in a good spot. And that's going to be someone that is going to still be at a higher risk of losing muscle or body comp not being in a good spot. Again, maybe there's someone that's like, they are super aggressive with fat loss and they just try to ramp up training a ton during that time. And it'd be just more like cardio based, or again, it's just not that we're not creating the right stimulus in that situation. That's going to be someone that's going to be more likely to lose muscle in that process there. So again, we have to take this, right? The main takeaway with this is just because you're in a fat loss phase doesn't mean that you automatically are, hey, I have to, training's gonna be terrible, et cetera. It is context dependent. Body fat levels, how long you've been doing it, the aggressiveness of your diet, obviously how the diet's set up in terms of meal timing, et cetera, are all going to play super important roles here in this process. So what about steps, right? How do we do steps here? Do you do more steps in a fat loss versus building, or what does that look like? And I think it's whatever you can stick with. I will sometimes push steps higher in a fat loss phase for clients, but just understand the higher you go, the return on investment does tend to decrease as you continue to get higher and higher. What I mean by that is the more you do, it's like the more time, you're probably not going to see as much. The body will start to compensate again the higher you get. And if we're not also increasing our intake with that, which again, it's okay, that doesn't make sense. And so the thought there is, yeah, obviously as you move more and more and calories come up with it, it's like you still can't create that massive deficit. So again, just understand that if you're creating that deficit through a lot of movement and low calorie intake, like there's going to be a limit to that. You can't move 30,000 steps and eat 500 calories, and your body's going to adapt to that, at least at some point. Maybe you could do that for 2 days, but eventually it's going to adapt to that, and you can't just keep that gap is too large there. So again, I think the ROI on it goes down. If you are someone that tends to move a lot from a lifestyle perspective, okay, like that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, we just have to we have to feel for that, and we just have to see how that deficit is for you there. But I think it's a good idea to maintain 8K steps per day year round, and not a bad idea to keep steps high even outside of fat loss, because again, I think that increases your overall energy flux. Movement's great. That's a great way to just get some kind of probably some slight aerobic adaptations, not that would be like probably training 10 plus reps away from failure. Yeah, are you going to see a ton of gains? No, but it's still going to be helpful. And obviously movement itself, it's powerful just by itself from an overall health perspective. It's going to keep you from an insulin sensitivity standpoint, it's going to keep that in a good spot. Mentally, it's going to keep you in a good spot. So I think it's important to keep steps high no matter what. So some takeaways here. When you're eating less, it's not the time to ramp up training like most people think and do. That doesn't mean you can't perform well in the fat loss phase. It just means that it's not the time to push the most. That should be reserved for periods where you're fueling enough to support it. So that really shows the importance of, hey, if you really want to add some muscle strength, build your performance, build your cardiovascular fitness, you need to do that in the phase outside of fat loss. Because again, fat loss should be a short, like, in the grand scheme of things, it should be a short phase. We shouldn't always live in this super restrictive state. This is why people who are always dieting tend to spin their wheels, because they never give their body enough fuel to truly push training, build muscle, and create meaningful changes in their physique. And so if you're always doing that, like that's going to be problematic. So again, some other takeaways here. Training should match available energy and recovery, not just your goal. If your goal is to be leaner, again, your training needs to match that available energy around that. So there. Building phases are the times to push volume, performance, and adaptations. Fat loss phases, we're more focused on maintaining our adaptations and managing recovery while creating that energy deficit. But that doesn't mean that you can't perform well in the fat loss. It's just not the time to push everything at once and to have your best absolute performance there. High output plus low calories are going to equal that poor recovery, compensation, and stalled progress. So we have to be very careful with extended periods of time with very high output and very low calories. The leaner you are, the deeper the deficit, and the longer you've been dieting, the less ability there is to push training. So you have to make adjustments around that there. And again, chronic dieting is going to equal never having the resources to truly improve your physique. You are going to eventually spin your wheels there if we're just chronically dieting there. So I hope this was helpful for you, gave you some more insight into how to maybe manage your training during fat loss in a building. Because again, like I said, I just see this usually get flip-flop backwards in terms of what that looks like. I hope this was helpful. Again, if you have any questions on this, just give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. That's where I'm most active there. And if you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find it. Talk to you guys soon.